Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of Insight. In Insight today, two major developments of the day, one around NSG and of course the one big development is around the Brexit. Well, it's a historic day. Britain has voted to leave the European Union and has put to rest a question that's been rumbling close to the surface of British politics for a generation. That is, the country should remain within the EU or move out and go it alone. The supporters of the Brexit are now calling it their Independence Day, but there's a lot in store for the UK and the world at large. UK will not leave immediately. It will still be a member of the European Union at this stage. However, the process of leaving will begin. Well, to talk more on this, I'm joined by Dr. Sreeram Chaulia from the Jindal School of International Studies. I'd like to start the discussion with you, Mr. Chaulia. How do you look at this verdict? Was it something on the expected lines or not?
It's a political earthquake. It's completely shaken up all the assumptions and the fundamentals and the structures that underpinned European order. Because until now, the European integration process has been going in one direction, which is adding more and more members. Now there are 28. If Britain leaves, it's going to, for the first time, go backwards, which is 27. And there could be a domino effect with some other countries with more Eurosceptic parties rising, also demanding referendums and to pull out. So I think it's in a way the biggest blow to the European project. If you go back in history since the 1950s, when they first started the coal and steel community, then the European Economic Community, Britain joined in the 70s, and now it looks like it has reached some kind of saturation point. It's not able to convince a lot of people on the grassroots for a variety of reasons, social, cultural issues with immigration, as well as economic, distribution of the benefits of integration. This whole liberal integration project has been imperiled, and what the vote today shows is that no matter how good these ideas are, single market, single currency, of course Britain was not even part of the single currency.
That's right.
But it was part of the
the
common
single
market.
That's right.
Then borderless trade, movement of people, all these basic assumptions. Even identity was supposed to have become more cosmopolitan. Younger people, even Britain, mind you, almost 48% or more voted to remain.
That's right.
So for a lot of them, it's I think a big shock to know that they are actually in the minority now, and that means that even the European Parliament, which has got more and more Eurosceptic parties getting MPs elected, it's now set up for an implosion unless the European elites led by Germany and France take corrective measures and reconnect to the grassroots, because what has happened is there's a big disconnect.
All those arguments from sovereignty to immigration issues to a lot of other issues like the EU courts, their intervention into human rights and other aspects, all that of course triggering the sovereignty part. Has it really surpassed all the other issues? I mean, there are people, even Indian commentators, who have said that sitting in Mumbai, the picture was entirely different from what it was, let's say, inside Britain. Well, how do you read it, Dr. Chaulia? Is it more about the sovereignty aspect, the fact that one of their leaders calls it the Independence Day?
I think there are deeper factors. For example, Britain has been declared as out of economic crisis, but it hasn't really the benefits of the rebound have not percolated across the society. So although David Cameron won a re-election last year in the general election, there is still a great sense of resentment at these outsiders, quote unquote migrants, who are coming and stealing our jobs and so on. So that factor was critical, and linked to that is a kind of racism and kind of a xenophobia, which even though Britain has had a multicultural ethos, has come back in a big way since the economic crisis began a few years ago. So that factor is there. It's like a backdrop factor. And then there is of course the continental politics. In the continental Europe itself, as I said, the Eurosceptic parties have been rising. So there's like the UK Independence Party and the other far right parties in Britain which voted for this, which campaigned for the Brexit, drew solace from the fact that this is now becoming widespread, and they even supported each other.
Yeah.
So these kind of factors were, I think, also there. But at the end of the day, it's about tugging at people's emotions and playing the identity card. Sometimes if the timing is right, like a country that is recovering from crisis, fascist or semi-fascist tendencies can come up, and that's what we are seeing. I mean, Nigel Farage is for me a soft fascist. Essentially what they are saying is, all brown people, all black people are evil and criminals and terrorists, and we need to keep them out. So it's a bit of, so the Trump kind of ideology, if it is working even in Europe, it has to do with...
You see a pattern here?
it's a I think a crisis of Western liberalism overall, because be it North America or Europe, there is a failure of the liberal elites. They thought that we are always right. They thought that there was a degree of smugness on their part that we are doing the right things, by breaking down the borders, and we are creating trade and free movement of labor and all these things. And they always try to argue that this is good for the people. But the people have not been convinced. So clearly there is a big disjuncture between the elite level discourse and the mood on the street. And I think even the turnout was high at 70%, but I think the turnout in favor of the Remain group was lower, obviously.
Yeah.
So they didn't make a big effort to to bring people out on the streets as much as the older voters who tend to be anyway politicized. So the youngsters, I think they stayed back thinking we are anyway going to win because the betting agencies are saying that we will remain.
True.
So I think even at the level of mobilization, there was huge mistakes made.
But what is it really going to trigger now? What happens to the EU is very important to look out for. Is there going to be further disintegration? Would the onus be now only on Germany? Or what if Germany, decides the other way tomorrow?
They will have to arrest the downslide, they will need to take drastic measures. They have to be much more liberal. Angela Merkel was catering more to domestic German electorate rather than the larger interests of the European region during the Eurozone crisis. Even with migration, she adopted a liberal stance, but it has backfired. So with the refugee crisis, so I think she will have to. I think now the time for talking is over. They need to actually reach out and connect to the grassroots again in a big way. Secondly, they have put countries like Hungary and Poland under notice, because these have become extreme far right ruled countries already, and clearly democracy itself is in threat in these countries. So it's like the former Soviet space is the most vulnerable now, because they have not had a long tradition of Western liberalism anyway. They've come out of authoritarian regimes for decades, and it's only 20 years, and not all of them have moved positively towards democratization. So there could be actually a kind of a reversal of democracy itself with the rise of these fascistic kind of tendencies. So I think for the Europeans, it's a big wake-up call, and they will need to also open the purse strings more. They've been very stingy, with the austerity and all these things. So all those have backfired now. Of course, Britain was not as affected by these policies because it was not as badly hit as these pigs economies, as they were called, Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain.
Right.
But nonetheless, Italy is very vulnerable because it is perennially broken politics and very poor economic performance. So there are some who are arguing that Italy may go next. So the question is, of course, people overreact after an incident, and maybe it will stabilize.
Yeah.
So, but they will be hoping it doesn't go down from 27 anymore, because it's so ironic that they are not willing to admit Turkey, which has wanted to come in, and here you are, countries that are already members saying, sorry, I better walk out.
Yeah.
So I think they have to recalculate. They may have to actually bring in some of these right-wing elements and absorb them into the system.
So would the world as a whole will have to approach again towards the issue of international cooperation, because EU was indeed a concept in that.
There is a very good chance that as this slide increases, that some of these old antagonisms which had for centuries brought war and misery to Europe could also resurface, because some of these populist demagogues like Viktor Orban of Hungary, for example, the president, they are not at all interested in compromise with anybody else. During the migrant crisis, we already saw that the EU was split down the middle. So what we are seeing is it will have serious economic impact as well, because if trade within the bloc now falls and they have to renegotiate all these things, tariff rates and all these things, it's going to also cut down on the prosperity prospect. So both in terms
prosperity of the region and these countries in particular.
Shared prosperity, the idea that we'll all together and we'll benefit together, that's in peril now.
That's in peril. Since it has happened now with one of the countries, there is a precedent. So others, of course, now, until now, of course, there was no other country which has done that in the past. But what happens next with, of course, the fact that the US had said it in the past too, that there is going to be, in fact, an impact on the economic ties, the trade ties of all these nations, and US in particular, with the UK. So how does that happen now?
Well, the special relationship will survive in a way. In fact, because of the special relationship across the Atlantic, the British have always felt that they are not really part of continental Europe. They didn't adopt the euro. If you go back in time historically also, even from the time of the Christian Reformation, when Henry VIII broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, Britain broke away with the Anglican Church away from the main continent. So they've had those traditions, and those are now coming to the fore. But I think, I mean, the US-Britain relationship will survive, of course. But what it means is that I think essentially the Americans will not be able to leverage Britain's role within the EU system. Because earlier Britain was like the voice of the Americans in the EU system, mostly promoting kind of liberal free market, especially under Cameron, because conservatives have been ruling for some time now, and even under Tony Blair they had moved to the free market kind of stuff. So now that voice is going to be missing, and the Germans are going to miss it the most, because France is very statist, Italy is completely dysfunctional, broken, Spain is on its knees. So what we are seeing now is like there's going to be no Britain for balancing out these multiple ideologies, and it simply means that right is going to be on the ascendant, right, kind of like a populist right, which is not necessarily going to promote the cooperation, the idea of cooperation. So conflict and instability are on the cards.
Okay, yeah. So that's going to be one major concern, and the fact that many of our people work in the UK. So what about the jobs and other related concerns?
It will be one ironic outcome for India and China.
Okay.
Because Cameron has been trying to woo these two big Asian giants for investment and so on. And now if City of London is broken away from Frankfurt, for example, which are the two big financial centers in Europe, then it's possible that actually they may depend more on Asian powers to bail them out. And to some extent, the Leave campaign was saying, we can always go, we have our own independent ties with the rest of the world, and we don't have to worry, we don't have to depend on these, Europeans anymore. So, they may be forced to actually do trade agreements and preferential agreements with China and India on more preferential basis for us. So ironically, Europe's and UK's loss could be a gain for us, but hardly in the larger scheme of things, it's not a great. They are British and Europeans are net losers.
How long will Britain have to survive the setback of this exercise economically?
Well, it has a financial industry that's quite vibrant and is connected globally, and it's mostly service driven. And they do host a large number of multinational corporations. But now MNCs will think about taxation, repatriation of profits on all these points, whether it is useful to headquarter in Britain or somewhere like Cologne or in Frankfurt, So they will need to think about these things, and it may, the worst fears are of a complete exodus of capital and a complete collapse of the pound sterling. That probably may not happen, because Britain is still probably in nominal GDP terms the 5th or 6th biggest in the world, and I think it will survive. But the point is, as Roger Cohen was saying on the New York Times, it is going to survive like an insular, isolated minnow. It had voice, it had some kind of stature within the EU, but now they've hacked, the electorate has hacked at its own feet. So instead of it becoming great again, what's going to happen is it's going to become little. Cameron's blunder was in being complacent. When he first announced the referendum in 2013, he thought he could just, ward off a challenge of a faction within his party by just throwing a sop at them. And he was, at that time, the Eurosceptic and anti-Euro forces were not as strong as they became in 3 years. They built up, steadily. So I think he thought he could just get away with it and, continue leading the party and the country. But I think this is, in fact, the problem of Cameron is multiplied across the European elites, All of them thought they were pretty smug and complacent. Even until this morning, most of them were betting that the Remain side will win.
But you see, Joe Cox's murder, in fact, the sentiment that it had highlighted at that point of time, which the world witnessed, probably was something that nobody could have missed. And it was actually after that incident that, the reports clearly suggested that there is indeed a balance between the two groups.
It wasn't a lasting effect, actually.
2 years is being...
Yeah, but some of the trading arrangements and all those to unwind them will take a long time. And even in fact, the immigrants will keep coming in, by the way, until there is a formal separation.
And the relationship between EU and Britain? What about that?
Well, I think they will have to renegotiate everything. I mean, some people have said we are going to go to the Norway model. Norway is not a member of the EU, but gets some benefits out of it, access to the common market, but doesn't have the migration and all those things. So, I think Britain, in a way, if Boris Johnson or somebody now takes over, or James Gove, or one of these conservative leaders within the Tory party who was for Brexit, they are going to push for a quicker separation to consolidate their own power and to win the next general election on their terms. So I think, and the Europeans are also going to be quick. They are not going to delay this, because the more this is in limbo, the less likely, the likelier that other vociferous tendencies will break out.
Okay.
Sreeram, it's also said that this is a vote of the working class against the free market economics. Is that partly true at least?
It was certainly billed as a revolt of the underdogs and of the peasants against the European establishment and their allies in the UK. But actually, if you break up the party divisions, then Labour was reluctantly also favouring remaining within the EU.
Majority, I was just reading some of the analysis which has come out after the results. It says that majority of the Labour have voted to remain, whereas majority of the Tories have voted to be out.
Yeah, so the Tory voters are not necessarily all the working class of England or of the UK, but still, I think it's we can frame it as a kind of a slap in the face of the establishment, as it was seen as faceless and as technocratic and as too overly liberal and not concerned about culture and moral values and identity and all these things. So in that sense, it was a kind of a cultural underclass plus some working class segments who were dissatisfied with the continued economic downturn. So although Cameron won a re-election on the basis of good economic performance and a rebound, it had not percolated to all sections of society, and somehow the general election, of course, he survived and came back, but this time on this issue, when it merged along with culture and with anti-immigrant xenophobia and all that, it became a winning combination for Leave.
Okay, Sreeram, Scotland now, is already people talking about a fresh referendum, and it has to, and I think don't you think it will become inevitable that they will have to go in for a fresh referendum as far as that is concerned? Because the fact that 62%, I think it is 62 or 69% of Scotland have voted to remain in the EU.
Yeah, but it's not yet inevitable because the centre, which is London, has to agree to it. It's a bit like Spain and the Basque separatists want an election, and or Catalonians want an election, but the central government is unwilling to do that. Last time Cameron had permitted it, knowing well that I think they were safe. But I don't think if a new kind of a more rightist Tory party comes into power, they will be willing to countenance another referendum, or at least they will not agree to it. So it will become unconstitutional. There may be a revolt. I mean, these are the worst case scenarios, and Scots have revolted over centuries against English domination. But the larger point is, yes, the fragmentation is happening, and it has happened in the name of democracy. I mean, Cameron let loose this whole saga, saying that we need to legitimize institutions, and he thought he was confident that he will win the votes. So in a way, I think he should have erred on the side of caution. The valor has really cost them, because what it has opened up this Pandora's box now. Absolutely. And it's so hard to put it back in.
Would you agree with that, Sreeram? India-UK partnership will get weaker now.
Well, yeah, for the near term, and for the British to recover. See, they had been rebounding relatively better than the continent of Europe, but now after this big shock, I think the economic crisis is going to resume full steam in Britain. Exogenous shocks and the cutoff from the European markets, all these things, and just the uncertainty that has been pointed out.
Okay.
So they are in for trouble, and means that their value has decreased in the world, including for us.
प्रोफेसर चौलिया, इसमें तीन महत्वपूर्ण चीज़ें हैं। पहली बात तो राजनीतिक तौर पर आज़ादी की बात की जा रही है, दूसरे जो है आर्थिक कारण सबसे बड़ा बताया जा रहा है, लेकिन इसमें जिसको बहुत भावनात्मक बनाने की कोशिश की गई है, बहुत जज्बाती मुद्दा बना दिया गया है, वो इमिग्रेशन का मुद्दा है। क्या आपको लगता है कि कहीं ना कहीं इस पर डर की राजनीति भी हो रही है कि लोग आकर आपकी नौकरियां चुरा रहे हैं? कुछ लोग कह रहे हैं कि देखिए पूरे ब्रिटेन को चुरा कर ले गए हैं, दूसरे यूरोप के जो दूसरे छोटे देश हैं वहाँ के लोग।
जी हाँ, डर की राजनीति कहें, आप जातिवाद कह लीजिए, असल में वही है आप कोर देखा जाए तो। और पोलैंड, ईस्टर्न जो पूर्वी यूरोप से जो आते रहते हैं माइग्रेंट्स,
पोर्चुगल के लिए हैं या दूसरे लोग
हैं। जी बिल्कुल, और मेडिटेरेनियन से भी जो कमजोर इकोनॉमीज हैं, वहाँ से काफी पलायन की तरह हुआ है, और
सस्ता लेबर मिल रहा है।
जी हाँ, ब्रिटेन को फायदा भी हुआ है। कई अर्थ विशेषज्ञ तो ये भी कहते हैं कि ब्रिटेन की जो ग्रोथ रेट है वो लगभग जर्मनी तक की बराबरी है, इसीलिए है क्योंकि वो इमिग्रेशन होता रहा है, और असल में देखा जाए तो फायदा भी होता है इसका। लेकिन जैसे आपने कहा, डर की राजनीति में लॉजिक नहीं होता। इसमें ये कहा जाता है कि देखिए ये बाहर वाले आ रहे हैं, और इनमें से क्रिमिनल्स भी होते हैं, टेररिस्ट भी होते हैं, और ये पूरे यूरोप में फैला हुआ है, सिर्फ ब्रिटेन में नहीं, जो कि ये इमिग्रेंट्स के खिलाफ एक तरह की एक हेट्रेड वाली राजनीति चल रही है। और इसमें राइट विंग जो आपने दक्षिणपंथी जो है उनके लिए खास फायदा होता है इसको।
इसमें ट्रम्प फैक्टर को आप कितना जिम्मेदार मानते हैं, क्योंकि खासकर जिस तरह से जो सीरियन इमिग्रेंट्स हैं उनको लेकर काफ़ी डर है, ये भी कहा जा रहा है कि ये लोग टेररिज्म फैला रहे हैं, खासकर जो भी कुछ पेरिस में हुआ उसके बाद से एक डर फैलाने की जो कोशिश है। आपको लगता है कि ये चाहे वो अमेरिका की बात हो लेकिन यूरोप में भी ट्रम्प फैक्टर काम कर रहा है?
सीधा उसका वास्ता है। बल्कि आप देखिए नाइजल फराज जो है यूके इंडिपेंडेंस पार्टी जो कि मेन है छोड़ने के लिए यूरोपियन यूनियन, उन्होंने तो पोस्टर भी इस्तेमाल किया है। यूरोप में जो सीरिया के जो शरणार्थी आ रहे हैं कॉन्टिनेंटल यूरोप में, उसका ब्रिटेन से कोई वास्ता भी नहीं है, लेकिन उनको दिखाया जा रहा है पोस्टर में कि ये देखो तादाद कितनी बड़ी है, लाखों लोग घुस के आ रहे हैं और हमें इन्हें रोकना है किसी न किसी हाल पर, और हमें यूरोपियन यूनियन में रहेंगे तो ये लोग मतलब भीड़ इकट्ठी होती जाएगी। बल्कि ये एक प्रोपेगेंडा है। असल में देखा जाए तो इंग्लैंड, आप यूके की आप ज्योग्राफी देखें तो पानी से अलग है वो कॉन्टिनेंट से, और इतने ज़्यादा शरणार्थी आते नहीं है। सो इसीलिए ये पॉलिटिक्स जो खेला जा रहा है ये एक डिवाइड एंड रूल वाली स्ट्रैटेजी है। राइट विंग में भी एक फूट है जैसे आपने कहा, और राइट विंग जो एक्सट्रीम राइट है उसको रोकने के लिए कैमरन ने पहले ये रेफरेंडम बुलाया, और अब देखिए लानत आ गई कि बड़े बुरे हाल में डेविड कैमरन। अगर
प्रोफेसर चौलिया ये बताइए कि राजनीति से अलग हटकर, या राजनीति भी इसमें शामिल है, जो सामाजिक मूल्यों का हम जिक्र करें जिसके लिए यूरोप खड़ा होता है, जो कि दुनिया को शायद एक बेहतर जगह बनाता है या उतनी खराब जगह होने से बचाता है जितना कि हो सकता था, खासकर ऐसे दौर में जहां आतंकवाद है, भय की राजनीति है। तो जो लिबरल वैल्यूज हैं यूरोपियन यूनियन के तमाम देशों की, जिसका कहीं ना कहीं नेतृत्व करता है ब्रिटेन काफी हद तक, मानवाधिकारों की हम बात कर लें, नागरिक अधिकारों का हम बात करें, रंग भेद के खिलाफ लड़ाई का हम जिक्र करें, अगर ब्रिटेन बाहर आता है तो आपको लगता है कि यूरोपियन यूनियन जिन वैल्यूज के लिए खड़ा होता है, जो मूल्य हैं उनके, क्या उन पर भी असर पड़ सकता है?
देखिए ब्रिटेन का जो पोजीशन है वो एक बैलेंसर की तरह है। जो कॉन्टिनेंटल यूरोप है उसके मुकाबले देखा जाए, जर्मन जो के लीडर हैं ईयू के, वो चाहते हैं कि ब्रिटेन रहे, खासकर क्योंकि बाकी जितनी कंट्रीज़ हैं, बड़ी देश हैं जैसे फ्रांस हैं, इटली हैं, स्पेन हैं, इन सब का जो एटीट्यूड है वो कम लिबरल का है। ब्रिटेन का हमेशा एक लिबरल डेमोक्रेटिक सेंटिमेंट रहा है, और इवन मार्केट, फ्री मार्केट वगैरह। तो ये जो आइडियाज़ हैं ये चाहती हैं कि जर्मनी चाहती है, खासतौर पर एंजेला मर्केल भी मेरे ख्याल से काफ़ी टेंशन में होंगी।
उन्होंने बयान दिया है बाकायदा कि वो चाहती हैं कि रिमेन में रहें।
बिल्कुल। और इवन प्रेसिडेंट ओबामा ने भी कहा है, बड़े बड़े दिग्गज दुनिया भर के ने कहा कि ब्रिटेन को रहना चाहिए ईयू में, क्योंकि उन सभी का यही डर है कि ये जो राइट वर्ड जो टर्न कहते हैं हम, जिसमें बहुत ज़्यादा फैशिस्ट या सेमी फैशिस्ट वाद की तरफ बढ़ता जा रहा है कॉन्टिनेंटल यूरोप, जिसमें कई पार्टियां आ गई हैं, सो कॉल्ड पॉपुलिस्ट पार्टीज, जैसे यूके में भी हैं, यूके इंडिपेंडेंस पार्टी वगैरह। इन सब की अगर ये मजबूत हो जाते हैं तो डेमोक्रेसी का भी बहुत बड़ा खतरा है। तो लॉन्ग रन में आप देखें तो ऐसा लग रहा है कि इवन पॉलिटिकल सिस्टम जो है यूरोप की, सोशल डेमोक्रेसी जो कहते हैं, उस पर भी थ्रेट है, लिबरल वैल्यूज पे भी थ्रेट है। और अगर इस तरह के एक हो जाए तो फिर आप देखिए हंगरी भी निकल सकता है। हंगरी वैसे भी काफी राइट विंग जा चुका है, पोलैंड भी जा चुका है, कुछ लोग कह रहे हैं इटली भी जाएगी अगर ब्रिटेन ने अगर रास्ता खोला तो इसी तरह एक तरह से पूरा टूट सकता है, बिखर सकता है, और ये बहुत बड़ा
और ज्यादा खून खराबे के लिए तैयार रहना होगा हमें।
20वीं सदी की सबसे बड़ी पॉलिटिकल इनोवेशन है यूरोपियन यूनियन, जिसने जैसे आपने कहा शांति कायम रखा और एक कॉमन मार्केट भी बनाई, लिविंग स्टैंडर्ड्स बढ़ाई। तो इन सब पे खतरा है इस ब्रेक्सिट।
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। समय मेरे पास समाप्त हो गया है। मैं जानती हूँ कि और कुछ जानकारियां आप देना चाहते थे, लेकिन फिलहाल कुछ ही घंटे का वक्त हमारे पास बाकी है। उसके बाद जैसे ही नतीजे आते हैं हम फिर एक बार इकट्ठा होंगे और बहस करेंगे उन नतीजों पर। फिलहाल अभी के लिए इतना ही। नमस्कार।